The morning mist clung to the muddy fields of northern France like a shroud over the dead. It was October 25th, 1415, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Across the narrow valley, two armies faced each other in a silence so profound it felt sacred. On one side, the flower of French nobility, thousands of knights in gleaming armor, their horses stamping impatiently in the soft earth. On the other, a ragged band of English soldiers, outnumbered perhaps 5-1, their faces gaunt from weeks of marching and disease. But among those English ranks stood men who would change the course of history forever. Men carrying weapons that seemed almost humble compared to the magnificent swords and lances of their enemies. Simple wooden bows, tall as a man, strung with hemp and sinew. These were the Longbowmen of England, and they were about to shatter an empire. What happened at Agincourt was more than just a battle. It was the violent death of an entire way of life. For centuries, the mounted knight had been the undisputed master of European warfare. Clad in steel, trained from childhood, these warriors represented the pinnacle of medieval military might. They were the aristocracy, the ruling class, men who believed their blood and breeding made them invincible. But on that rain-soaked field in France, common English yeomen would prove them catastrophically wrong. The story of Agincourt begins not with the clash of armies, but with the audacious ambition of a young English king who refused to accept the limitations of his birthright. Henry V had inherited a throne burdened by debt, rebellion, and the constant threat of civil war. England was a minor player on the European stage, overshadowed by the wealth and power of France. Most kings would have been content to consolidate their domestic position and avoid foreign adventures. Henry was not most kings. In the summer of 1415, he crossed the English Channel with an invasion force of perhaps 8,000 men. His target was not some border skirmish or limited raid. Henry claimed the throne of France itself, asserting ancient rights through his great-great-grandmother Isabella, who had been a French princess. To most observers, this seemed like madness. France was the greatest power in Europe, with a population perhaps 5 times that of England and resources to match. But Henry understood something that his enemies did not. Warfare itself was changing, and those who adapted fastest would inherit the future. The English army that landed on the Norman coast was unlike anything that had come before. Yes, it contained knights and men-at-arms, the traditional backbone of medieval armies, but the real strength lay in its archers. Thousands of longbowmen, drawn from the yeomanry of England and Wales, men who had spent their lives hunting in forests and practicing at village butts. These were not professional soldiers in the modern sense. They were farmers, craftsmen, laborers who had been called to serve their king, but they possessed a weapon that had been perfected over generations of warfare against the Scots and Welsh. The English longbow was a marvel of medieval technology, carved from yew wood and capable of loosing arrows with devastating accuracy and power at ranges that seemed impossible to their enemies. The campaign began well enough for Henry. His forces besieged and captured the port of Harfleur, giving England a foothold on French soil. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Dysentery swept through the English ranks, killing more men than any battle. By the time Harfleur fell, Henry's army was already a shadow of its former strength, perhaps 5,000 men remaining from the original 8,000. Any sensible commander would have consolidated his gains and prepared for winter. Henry chose instead to march across northern France to Calais, the last English stronghold on the continent. It was a journey of nearly 200 miles through hostile territory, with winter approaching and his men already weakened by disease and exhaustion. The French, meanwhile, were mobilizing the greatest army they had assembled in decades. Charles VI, the mad king of France, was in no condition to lead, but his nobles needed no royal encouragement to respond to this English provocation. From across the kingdom, they converged on the path Henry must take. Knights from Burgundy, Normandy, Picardy, and beyond, men whose ancestors had fought at Poitiers and Crécy, who remembered the humiliations their grandfathers had suffered at English hands. This time would be different. This time, French chivalry would not be caught unprepared. The two armies finally came together near the village of Agincourt, in a narrow valley flanked by woods on either side. It was perhaps the worst possible terrain for the French, who needed room to deploy their massive cavalry formations, but they were confident that sheer weight of numbers would carry the day. Contemporary chronicles suggest the French outnumbered the English by at least 4-1, possibly more. On the night of October 24th, the armies camped within sight of each other. The French spent the evening in celebration, confident of victory. They divided up the expected ransoms they would collect from English prisoners, argued over who would have the honor of capturing King Henry himself. Wine flowed freely, and the flower of French nobility made merry on the eve of what they believed would be their greatest triumph. The English camp was a study in contrasts. Henry moved among his men, speaking words of encouragement, sharing their fears and their determination. These soldiers knew they were outnumbered and far from home. They had marched for weeks through enemy territory, weakened by disease, short of supplies. Many had made their peace with God, expecting to die on the morrow, but they also knew something the French did not. They had weapons and tactics that could level the playing field in ways their enemies could not imagine. The longbow that these English archers carried was not merely a hunting weapon scaled up for war. It was the product of centuries of evolution, a technology that had reached its absolute peak. Standing 6 feet tall, crafted from the heartwood of the yew tree, it required tremendous strength to draw and years of practice to master. The pull weight of a warbow could exceed 150 pounds, far more than modern compound bows used by hunters. But the real innovation was not in the bow itself, but in how the English had learned to use it. Where other armies employed archers as skirmishers or support troops, the English had made them the centerpiece of their tactical doctrine. These longbowmen fought in massed formations, loosing volleys of arrows in coordinated waves that could darken the sky and shatter enemy formations before they could close to melee range. The arrows themselves were marvels of medieval engineering. The bodkins, as they were called, featured narrow steel points designed specifically to penetrate armor. They could punch through chainmail at close range and find the gaps in even the finest plate armor. A skilled archer could loose 12 arrows in a minute, and when hundreds of bowmen shot together, the effect was devastating. As dawn broke over the muddy fields of Agincourt, both armies prepared for battle. The French formed up in their traditional fashion, with dismounted knights in the front ranks and cavalry on the flanks. It was a formation that had served them well for generations, the embodiment of medieval military doctrine: heavy armor, disciplined advance, shock combat at close quarters. The English deployment was radically different. Henry placed his men-at-arms in the center, but the real strength of his line lay in the wedges of longbowmen, positioned on either flank and interspersed with the heavy infantry. Each archer had driven stakes into the ground before his position, creating a forest of sharpened points to break up cavalry charges. The stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through the centuries. On one side, the old world of chivalry and noble combat. On the other, a new kind of warfare that valued effectiveness over honor, results over tradition. Neither army could have imagined the revolution that was about to unfold. The French advance began with all the pageantry their noble blood demanded. Banners snapped in the morning breeze, displaying the heraldry of the greatest houses in France. The Dukes of Alençon and Orléans rode at the head of their retinues, their armor polished to mirror brightness, their horses prancing beneath them. Behind them marched rank upon rank of dismounted knights, their steel sabatons squelching in the churned mud as they advanced in perfect formation. To the watching English, it must have seemed like witnessing the approach of an avalanche. The ground trembled under thousands of armored feet, the air filled with the clash of steel, the creak of leather, and the rhythmic chanting of French war cries. This was medieval warfare at its most magnificent, a display of power and wealth that spoke to centuries of military tradition. But magnificence and effectiveness are not the same thing. The narrow valley that contained the battlefield was perhaps 3/4 of a mile wide, hemmed in by dense woods on both sides. For the French, accustomed to sweeping cavalry charges across open ground, this terrain was a nightmare. Their massive formations compressed into a funnel, unable to deploy properly or bring their full strength to bear. Worse still, the recent rains had turned the plowed fields into a quagmire that sucked at their feet with every step. Henry watched the French advance from his position in the English center. He had chosen this ground deliberately, understanding that terrain could be as powerful a weapon as any bow or sword. The young king had studied the battles of Crécy and Poitiers, where English longbowmen had bloodied French knights before. But those victories had been won through defensive fighting, waiting for the enemy to attack prepared positions. Today would be different. Today, Henry would prove that English archery could destroy an enemy army in open battle. The order came down the English line like a whisper of death. Draw. Thousands of longbowmen reached for their arrows, selecting bodkins from the sheaves planted in the mud before them. The motion was fluid, practiced, each archer moving with the unconscious grace that came from years of training. These men had been shooting since childhood, their bodies shaped by the constant pull of the bowstring until their left arms were visibly larger than their right. Knock. The arrows found their places on the strings, steel points gleaming dully in the grey morning light. The French were perhaps 200 yards away now, close enough that individual faces could be seen beneath raised visors, close enough for the archers to pick their targets, to see the confidence in those noble features, the certainty of victory written in every stride. Draw. The longbows came back as one, a forest of yew wood bending under tremendous tension. The archers' bodies formed perfect lines of force, backs straight, left arms extended, right hands anchored at their cheeks. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the two armies faced each other in perfect stillness. The French advancing with inexorable power, the English poised like a coiled spring. Then Henry's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. Loose! The sound was unlike anything the French had ever heard. Not the whistle of individual arrows, but a rushing roar like wind through a forest canopy. The sky darkened as thousands of shafts arced upward, reaching the peak of their trajectory before plunging earthward with the weight of falling stars. The French looked up in amazement, many seeing massed archery for the first time in their lives. The first volley struck with the sound of summer hail on a stone roof. Arrows punched through steel plates, found the joints in armor, skewered men through their visors. Horses screamed and reared as bodkins drove deep into their flanks. The perfect French formation wavered as men stumbled and fell, as gaps opened in their ranks. But the French were veterans, nobles who had trained for war since childhood. They closed their ranks and pressed forward, stepping over their fallen comrades, maintaining their discipline even as the second volley darkened the sky above them. These were not peasant levies who would break at the first sign of casualties. They were the flower of French chivalry, and they would not be turned back by mere arrows. The third volley was even more devastating than the first two. The range had closed now, and the longbowmen could pick their targets with deadly precision. Arrows found every weakness in the French armor, every gap between plates, every vulnerable joint. Men who had seemed invincible moments before now lay writhing in the mud, their bright surcoats stained crimson, yet still the French came on. Their courage was magnificent, even as it led them to destruction. Knights who had taken multiple arrows continued to advance, driven by pride and honor and the absolute certainty that they could not be defeated by commoners with peasant weapons. They had been raised to believe in their own invincibility, taught from birth that their noble blood made them superior to ordinary men. The longbowmen proved them wrong with mathematical precision. Arrow after arrow, volley after volley, the deadly rain continued without pause. The English archers had trained for this moment their entire lives, and they shot with the mechanical efficiency of craftsmen at their trade. There was no emotion in it, no hatred or anger, just the smooth draw, the careful aim, the release that sent another steel point seeking flesh. The French cavalry, what remained of it, finally reached the English stakes, but the charge that should have shattered the enemy line instead broke apart like waves against a rocky shore. Horses impaled themselves on the sharpened points, throwing their riders into the mud. Those knights who survived the fall found themselves struggling to their feet in armor that weighed 60 pounds or more, sinking to their knees in ground that had been churned to soup by the passage of thousands of feet. The slaughter was methodical now. English men-at-arms moved forward with knives and war hammers, finishing wounded Frenchmen who could not rise from the mud. The longbowmen continued shooting into the packed French rear ranks, where men pressed forward even as their comrades died around them. There was nowhere to retreat in the narrow valley, nowhere to maneuver away from the deadly rain of arrows. In perhaps 30 minutes of fighting, the greatest army France had assembled in decades was destroyed. Not defeated, not routed, but utterly annihilated. The flower of French nobility lay scattered across a field that had been transformed into a charnel house. Knights who had ridden to war in golden armor were now indistinguishable from the mud that covered them. The survivors, those few who could still walk, stumbled away in shock and disbelief. These were men who had never known defeat, who had been raised to believe that courage and noble blood were all that mattered in war. The Longbowmen had taught them a lesson in mathematics instead. Superior numbers, better positioning, more effective weapons, disciplined training. The romantic ideals of chivalry meant nothing when faced with professional competence. King Henry himself walked among the fallen as the last echoes of battle faded into silence. His boots squelched in mud that had been transformed from brown earth into something darker, richer, fed by the blood of France's finest. The young monarch who had crossed the Channel with such audacious dreams now stood witness to a transformation that went far beyond his personal ambitions. He had not merely won a battle, he had presided over the funeral of an entire worldview. The statistics were staggering, almost impossible to believe. French casualties numbered in the thousands, with estimates ranging from 4,000 to 10,000 dead. Among them lay the Dukes of Alençon, Bar, and Brabant. The flower of French nobility, men whose lineages stretched back to Charlemagne, now fed the earth of northern France. English losses, by contrast, were almost negligible. Perhaps 25 men, possibly fewer. It was not victory in the traditional sense. It was mathematical annihilation. The Longbowmen who had wrought this destruction stood among their empty quivers, many of them still hardly believing what they had accomplished. These were farmers and craftsmen, men who tended sheep and worked leather, who measured their wealth in copper pennies rather than golden livres, yet they had destroyed the greatest army in Christendom with weapons they had carved from English yew and arrows they had fletched with goose feathers. The psychological impact was even more devastating than the physical carnage. For generations, European warfare had been built upon certain fundamental assumptions. That noble blood carried with it martial superiority. That heavy cavalry was the decisive arm of battle. That individual prowess and chivalric virtue mattered more than mere numbers or equipment. Agincourt shattered these beliefs like glass struck by a hammer. The French survivors who limped away from that terrible field carried with them a truth that would poison their military thinking for decades to come. They had been beaten not by superior courage or divine favor, but by superior technology wielded by better trained troops. The longbow had revealed the fundamental weakness of knightly warfare. For all their magnificence, for all their training and breeding, knights were simply men in metal shells. And shells, no matter how beautifully crafted, could be cracked. News of the victory spread across Europe like wildfire, carrying with it implications that went far beyond the immediate military situation. In England, Henry was hailed as a new Arthur, a warrior king who had restored English pride and proven the nation's martial superiority. Church bells rang from Cornwall to the Scottish borders, and common folk who had never seen France celebrated, as if they had personally struck down the enemy. But the deeper significance lay in what Agincourt revealed about the changing nature of power itself. The English longbowmen were not aristocrats. They held no titles, owned no vast estates, commanded no feudal levies. Their strength came not from birth but from skill, not from inheritance but from practice. They represented a new kind of military force, one based on professional competence rather than social status. This transformation had been building for decades, visible to those who knew how to read the signs. At Crécy in 1346, English archers had bloodied French knights, but in a defensive battle from prepared positions. At Poitiers 10 years later, the Black Prince had won through superior tactics and favorable terrain. But Agincourt was different. Here, in open battle on ground of their own choosing, the French had deployed everything they had learned from previous defeats. They had advanced on foot to avoid the vulnerability of mounted charges. They had concentrated their forces to maximize impact. They had chosen the time and place of battle, and they had still been destroyed. The longbow itself was reaching the peak of its development in 1415. Bows found on the wreck of the Mary Rose, Henry's great warship that sank 30 years later, showed draw weights approaching 200 pounds. These were weapons that required not just skill but physical transformation. English archers developed a distinctive skeletal structure from years of practice, their left shoulder blades enlarged and reinforced to handle the tremendous forces involved in drawing a war bow. The arrows they shot were equally specialized. The bodkin points that had punched through French armor were marvels of medieval metallurgy, hardened steel tips that could penetrate even the finest plate at close range. But it was not just the individual weapons that made English archery so deadly. It was the systematic way the English had developed their use. Unlike other nations that employed archers as light troops or skirmishers, England had made them the centerpiece of military doctrine. English archers fought in massed formations, their volleys coordinated to create killing zones that no enemy could survive. They trained constantly, not just in shooting but in battlefield maneuvers, learning to reposition quickly while maintaining their rate of fire. Most importantly, they were integrated with the rest of the army, their capabilities understood and utilized by commanders who had grown up with longbow tactics. The French had no equivalent system. Their military culture remained focused on individual combat, on the personal prowess of knights who fought for glory and honor. They had excellent crossbowmen, but these were foreign mercenaries, Genoese professionals, who were never fully integrated into French tactical thinking. When French nobles encountered massed English archery, they had no doctrine for dealing with it except courage and determination. Courage and determination, as Agincourt proved, were not enough. The battle marked the beginning of the end for medieval chivalry, though few recognized it at the time. The mounted knight would continue to dominate battlefields for another century, but his supremacy was now challenged by new technologies and new ideas about warfare. The Swiss pike squares, the Bohemian war wagons, the early firearms that were beginning to appear on European battlefields, all represented the same fundamental shift that the longbow had pioneered. Professional skill was replacing noble birth as the determinant of military effectiveness. The social implications were profound. For centuries, political power had flowed from military capability. Those who could fight effectively ruled those who could not. The knight's monopoly on heavy cavalry had translated directly into political dominance, the foundation of the feudal system that governed medieval Europe. But if common archers could destroy knights, what did that mean for the social to England as heroes? But they also returned as something order itself. Henry's archers returned new. They common men were who had proven themselves who superior to nobles. Peas. The king rewarded them had humbled princes with lands and titles, creating a new class of military professionals whose authority came not from blood, but from battlefield effectiveness. It was a revolutionary concept. Though few understood its implications at the time, the French response to Agincourt revealed the depth of their confusion. Rather than acknowledging the superiority of English tactics and adapting accordingly, they blamed their defeat on treachery, on unfavorable conditions, on anything except the fundamental obsolescence of their military system. French chroniclers wrote bitter accounts of English dishonor, claiming that true knights could never be defeated by mere arrows. They were like men trying to hold back the tide with their bare hands. Some French commanders did learn from the disaster. Joan of Arc, the peasant girl who would later lead French armies to victory, understood instinctively what the nobles had missed. Warfare was changing, and victory belonged to those who adapted fastest. Her successes came not from reviving chivalric traditions, but from embracing new tactics, from using artillery and disciplined infantry in ways that maximized their effectiveness against English longbowmen. But Joan was the exception. Most French nobles spent the decades after Agincourt trying to restore a military system that had been proven fatally flawed. They developed new armor, refined their tactics, sought magical solutions to what was fundamentally a technological problem. They could not accept that their way of life was ending, that the world was changing in ways that made their skills and values obsolete. The English, meanwhile, continued to refine their archery. They established training grounds throughout the kingdom, offered tax incentives for bowyers and fletchers, made archery practice mandatory for all able-bodied men. The longbow became more than a weapon. It became a symbol of English identity, proof of the nation's martial superiority and divine favor. When Shakespeare wrote of Agincourt 2 centuries later, he captured this spirit perfectly. His Henry addresses his archers not as subjects but as brothers, united by shared danger and common purpose. The battle's impact extended far beyond military affairs. Agincourt demonstrated that traditional authority could be challenged, that established hierarchies were not ordained by God or nature, but created by human choices. If noble knights could be defeated by common archers, what other assumptions about society might prove equally false? The question would echo through the centuries, contributing to religious reformation, political revolution, and social transformation. The Longbowmen themselves became legends in their own lifetimes. Stories spread of their incredible accuracy, their ability to split arrows at impossible ranges, their cool professionalism under fire. These tales were often exaggerated, but they reflected a deeper truth. For the first time in European history, common soldiers had proven themselves superior to nobles, not through luck or divine intervention, but through superior skill and training. The mud-stained field at Agincourt fell silent as the last cries of the wounded faded into memory. What had begun as a clash between armies ended as something far more profound. The death of an age, the birth of a new world. On that October morning, the Longbowmen of England had not merely won a battle, they had rewritten the rules of power itself. The yew boughs that darkened the sky above France carried with them the seeds of revolution. Every arrow that found its mark struck not just French armor, but the very foundations of medieval society. The message was unmistakable. Noble blood meant nothing against professional skill. Centuries of tradition crumbled before disciplined competence. The future belonged not to those born to rule, but to those trained to excel. And in that terrible mathematics of war, where English farmers proved superior to French princes, we see the dawn of the modern world. Agincourt was more than victory. It was prophecy, written in steel and yew, and the courage of common men who dared to aim their arrows at the gods of their age and watch them fall.